Well, thanks everyone for being here. Nancy Strunk gets credit for initiating this whole process because I visited, as I said in the invitation, I visited a handful of the larger offices, which accounts for a large percentage of our membership. But number one, not everyone that's part of those offices who was interested in the update was able to be there on the days when I was there. And number two, we have, as you saw, a ton of smaller offices. And much to the relief of those smaller offices, I'm not going and visiting all of them in person. So thank you all for being here. What's a speaker got to do to get people to move up like 3 rows? Come on, guys. So, I mean, just looking at who's here, a lot of you are folks that have already been heavily involved. So the first part of what I'm going to talk about, way to be a nonconformist, Cindy, Betty. Oh, see, this puts several of you now within spitting distance. Perfect. Yeah. Part of what I want to talk about briefly will be a review to many of you who have already been involved, but I see a few faces of folks who are relatively new and or have not been involved. So I'm going to spend just a minute kind of giving a very quick overview of sort of how this place runs, because part of why I wanted to talk to the members is to encourage involvement. And I remember, I was a Realtor member here for over 10 years, close to a dozen years, before I really had the slightest clue how the organization runs. In fact, I got drafted by the nominating committee and ran for an executive officer position without really knowing entirely how the place runs. But I know way more than I ever wanted to now. So CCAR, as many of you know, is governed by the board of directors. That's the top policy-making body for the organization. Linda directly answers. Linda's the association executive, so she's our chief executive officer. Linda is directly accountable to the board of directors, so the board of directors has direct oversight over Linda. Linda acts sort of as a firewall, though, because all of the staff belong to Linda. They don't belong to the board of directors. So even if Susie makes me really mad, Susie has no direct accountability to me at all. She belongs to Linda, and Linda's in charge of that whole process. So the board of directors makes all of the major decisions. The staff carries those out. Linda's the chief executive in charge of execution of those. The board is chaired by the president, which in a lot of ways means that you have a lot less power because you don't get to vote unless you're making or breaking a tie. And the executive officer positions, commonly people refer to that as running the chairs because as you noticed, I had noticed but didn't understand until I was drafted myself, the only typically open elected position is secretary-treasurer. We have at-large board seats, so every year we have a few seats on the board of directors for 3-year terms that are open, or possibly an open election for the remainder, the not yet expired portion of a 3-year term in progress if one of those members resigned or ran for an executive officer. So you run typically for secretary-treasurer because that's normally the only open executive officer position you run for. Nobody runs for that because they want to be the one in charge of watching the books for the organization, except maybe Todd Salin, who has probably done a better job with that than anybody in the history of the organization has. But most people are doing that because they are being elected into leadership, and the term is run the chairs. Once you're elected into that open executive officer position, the entry one being secretary-treasurer, you start down this 4-year process where you would, barring some major scandal or a petition drive to get you out, normally you'll go from secretary-treasurer 1 year to president-elect to president, and then you stay on the board as immediate past president. That means that our organization has a couple of interesting dynamics. The president's only there for a year. Linda's been here a very long time. She watches presidents come and go like that from her historic perspective. But when you start running those chairs, that means you are starting a 4-year period where you're on the board and will have a vote and a voice in the process. And the fact that we keep the immediate past president on the board means that we have some continuity of leadership. So if you think about it in terms of, running 4 years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, through those chairs, you at least have the benefit of watching the people in the years ahead of you. You have a pretty good sense of how things run before you're the one that's sitting in the president's seat. So that's how that works. Those of you who have ever thought, and raise your hand, who's ever thought, what are the idiots at CCAR thinking when, and then you fill in the blank? Everyone has thought that. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So part of my message to those of you who are here, some of you have already done this, but part of my message is you can be one of those idiots. Some of you have been one of those idiots. But understand you can't just decide you want to run for secretary treasurer and run the chairs. You have to have some prerequisite levels of service in the organization for a couple of reasons. Number one, you want to have had involvement in the organization enough to know what's going on so you know what you're doing if you decide to run for the board of directors or for an executive officer position. And number two, the board needs to make sure that you're a qualified candidate before they're slating you to run, or the nominating committee does. So we have some prerequisite requirements before you can land on the board. So number one, if you want to do that, you need prerequisite levels of service. But number two, there are a lot of really important levels of service that start out someplace other than the board of directors or other than the MLS committee. MLS also has some prerequisite requirements to serve. I'm going to run through a very quick list of committees just so all of you are aware of how many different areas there are within our organization for service. MLS committee, commercial MLS committee, professional standards, grievance, government affairs, member services, professional development, association operations. Then within those committees we have working groups, and the working groups include the technology working group, education working group, special projects. Now raise your hand if you are currently serving on any of those. Great, so we've got a high level of involvement. Raise your hand if you have served in the past. Yeah, so I mean a lot of you here have been through part of this process, and thank you for your service. People who haven't served don't realize how important the work is that gets done at the committee or at the working group level. The other point I want to make is if you haven't been involved before, there are enough different ways in which you can get plugged into the organization that you can make it fun and enjoyable. Everyone has different personalities, different strengths, and it's really fun watching people find their niche within the organization where they genuinely, light up. Kimberly Chrisman comes to mind. She loves serving she's on either Pro Standards or Grievance, and she loves it, and she's on MLS. And so she's somebody who's gotten plugged into some fairly technical areas of the organization, which kind of surprised me, but she does very well at it and has had a very good time. So part of the message is understand there are a lot of different areas you can get plugged in, and that means that there's no reason not to get plugged in unless you've found the right fit. Please don't hesitate to contact me or the association staff at any time if you want to see, here are my interests, what are areas where we need volunteers, where it might be the best fit for me. Any questions about that? One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about today is encourage involvement not just at CCAR, but encourage involvement at the Illinois Association of Realtors level. So just like I said, I had been a Realtor member here for over a decade before I really had any sense for how the organization operates or how much important work gets ground out at the working group and committee level. The same is true of the Illinois Association of Realtors. I had had no real involvement with the Illinois Association of Realtors until I was elected secretary-treasurer here, and then the executive officers end up involved in various levels of the Illinois Association of Realtors. There are certain events that happen every year. The Professional Standards Workshop in January is one that many of our members go to if they serve on Grievance, Pro Standards, or as an executive officer. So that's been a whole other learning experience. And many of our members, the overwhelming majority, pay their dues checks, part of which goes to IAR, part of which goes to national, and they don't think anything of it. And an awful lot of our members, if you were to ask them what the heck do you think IAR does for you, would be at a total loss to explain. And having gotten involved at the Illinois Association of Realtors level, it's really amazing how much work gets done on our behalf for a relatively small investment. So my big eye-opening experience was going to Capital Conference, which happens every year in March. And that is a designated opportunity day for realtors all over the state. And it's open to all realtors, so you don't have to be in a particular level of service or involvement. It's open to all realtors in the state to basically converge on the state capitol and make their presence and their voice known and heard to lawmakers at the Capitol and to the governor. And so in one day, I went from really being pretty much oblivious to what the State Association of Realtors does to being enormously impressed with how much gets done on our behalf and for a really amazing bargain price. Capital Conference in one day is a great way to go from zero to sort of a critical mass of knowledge in terms of what is going on there. And I think, in my case, really motivated me to get and stay involved at the state level. I have a 2-minute video on Capital Conference that I'll play if we can get the front lights turned off, please.
My big issue is municipal intervention and overregulation.
Adding more and more rules and regulations and things to that are just not going to help it any.
Making sure that the government doesn't get excessively interventionist.
Any kind of fee is another way to tax the property.
The laws they're making are affecting our business and how we do business.
Real estate is politics, and it all begins here.
The majority of what we do here is try to stop bad ideas. I mean, that's part of the role we play in the process and being that watchdog on behalf of property owners and homeowners and your colleagues in the industry. We make sure that if legislature does something, the property law area, that it's balanced.
A lot of issues that are on the table today, both in the state and nationally, that need to be discussed and need to be heard.
I mean, we see the issues every day, and with the foreclosures and short sales that are out there, you know, we do see a lot of fees.
Ultimately, what it's doing is it's costing consumers more money, it's costing realtors more money, it's costing banks more money, it's costing everybody more money.
That's the problem. If we keep adding more and more expenses to these sellers who are already upside down or in trouble, it really makes it difficult to sell.
It's fruitless to just sit there and say, oh, I wish I could do something, or I don't like this. If you don't act, you don't get anything done.
And this is our day that we're able to come down here and talk to our state representatives and be heard.
They're paying attention to us now more than ever.
If we didn't do it, nobody else would.
So every General Assembly runs a 2-year term, and in the course of each General Assembly there are literally thousands of pieces of legislation that get proposed during each of those legislative terms. Who in this room wants to be in charge of monitoring all of that to weed out which of those involves something that's going to wreak havoc on the real estate industry? Anyone? Anyone? No, we have other things to be doing. The thing that's a real eye-opener at the state association level, especially relative to the small investment that we make in dues dollars, is that Greg St. Aubin, the guy that was the last one that spoke, that was behind a lectern, they have a whole government affairs staff, so these are basically lobbyists. He's their chief lobbyist. He's the head of the government affairs division of the Illinois Association of Realtors. And in today's political environment, you hear the term lobbyist and it has all sorts of negative and even scandalous connotations. What is most impressive about our trade organization at the state and national level is that lawmakers, our guys are not the sleazy guys who are dragging lawmakers into a back room and slipping them a couple of Benjamin Franklins to try to get a vote bought. Our guys are looked at as serious subject matter experts. When legislation is pending or being proposed, the legislators are seeking out our government affairs staffers because our government affairs staffers are serious, technically minded subject matter experts who are able to explain in pretty objective terms, here are the unintended consequences that a particular type of proposed legislation could have. Not only is that government affairs staff doing work nonstop, reviewing everything that has a potential effect on real estate that goes through the Capitol, but in some cases, if there's a legislator that has a particular idea, it is not at all uncommon for an Illinois Association of Realtors government affairs staffer to write the legislation. If they agree it's not going to be harmful to the industry or that it may be helpful to the industry, it's not uncommon for the actual legislative drafting to be done by our staffers to help ensure that it gets done to protect the best interest of the realtors. The other interesting thing is beyond the state capitol, it's very surprising to see that the government affairs staff members fan out all over the state. Each association has a government affairs director. So you'll hear the term GAD if you sit through meetings here. Our government affairs director is Neil Malone, and these guys have geographic sections of the state, so they'll cover more than one local association in most cases. Neil is the name of our guy, and these government affairs staffers are not just doing work in the state capitol. These are people who go out and do work in individual county and municipalities to help make sure that legislation and ordinances that would be injurious to members of our profession at the county and local level get beaten back if necessary, modified if it needs a tweak, or enacted if it's something that's proposed that needs the support of the realtor organization to help ensure that helpful ordinances and legislation get passed. A recent example is Normal, which of course is a relatively small municipality, had on the table an ordinance that would have mandated sprinklers in all new construction, residential new construction. That adds on average somewhere around $8,000 to the cost of new construction, to the cost of the new construction. That's before you factor in the higher insurance premiums that a homeowner would have to pay to get the rider that covers the damage to the house when the sprinkler system leaks and causes a flood. Whole other issue. That's a really thorny issue because, of course, first responders and firefighters are spinning it as an issue of, if you don't like dead children, you'll want sprinklers. But if you want to be able to afford a house, you need to not have the price jacked up by $8,000 or $10,000 plus higher ongoing costs for insurance, particularly in light of the fact that new construction is the least likely to burn. So areas like that, that's a very technical issue, and it also is an emotionally charged issue, but it is one where our staffers at the Illinois Association of Realtors are getting boots on the ground at individual municipalities and counties where those efforts make the critical difference in beating back legislation or ordinances that would be extremely harmful to members of our industry. And part of why they'll do that is because it turns out that all of these county board members and city council members from one municipality to the next, they talk. So if you don't beat it back at Normal, Illinois, because those of us south of I-80 are used to having the entire state hijacked by people north of I-80. But if you don't beat something like that back in Normal, Illinois, some other municipality, and eventually some of the really large ones, start enacting it. So I want to make the point that the return on your dues dollars at the state association level are tremendous. It is one of the best bargains that you can possibly imagine, and specifically the best way for you to see that is sign up for Capitol Conference. If you're not currently serving in a capacity here where we pay for you to go, sign up anyway. It costs about $25, $30, something like that, if you're not getting it paid for as a serving board member or government affairs member here.
It's $40 for Capitol Conference, $30 for the housing opportunity, which is new this year, or $60 for both.
Is the housing opportunity one the one that's limited in enrollment?
Just for the rooms. It's not limited in
Okay,
enrollment.
so okay, so we don't cap out on that. So for $40, and part of the $40 is you're getting a lunch with your government affairs director, so you'd actually get to sit down and chat with Neil in a relatively small group. I would tell you it is worth going if for no other reason than the field trip experience. I hadn't been in the state capitol until Capitol Conference since I was an elementary school child and had gone on a school field trip. For as scandalous a state, comically scandalized a state as we live in and work in, our state capitol is just awe-inspiring. It is a spectacular place. It oozes with all sorts of history. And the other really interesting, eye-opening experience is you get to meet with your area legislators. The first year I went to Capitol Conference, I was standing face-to-face having conversations with every legislator whose district overlaps with our MLS geography. So you also come away from that day with given how scandalized the state government is, with a real appreciation for how good our guys are, regardless of party. These are generally very good people who want to do the right thing and truly benefit from our input. This isn't about self-serving. One of the best things about our trade organization is not just that it's protecting the interests of the realtor members. Most of our interests are aligned with the interest of the public. We're protecting private property rights. So our trade organization and the interests that it's protecting are generally very, very favorable to the public as well. Any questions about that? If you have, yes, Julie.
Make a mention that they can contribute to RPAC.
I'm going to show an RPAC video next. So if we can get the lights, I got another video to show. Excellent segue. Thank you so much. RPAC is the Realtor Political Action Committee. So when you can hang on just a second, Susie. Just stand right there at the ready. The Realtor Political Action Committee. So we have dues dollars that go to support the State Association of Realtors. The Realtor Political Action Committee is a separate PAC that is able to contribute dollars strategically to help ensure that we elect and keep in office members of the state and national legislatures that are favorable to realtor interests. And interestingly, it's very nonpartisan. People will complain all the time, and this is how government affairs knows they're allocating their RPAC dollars well, when the Republicans and the Democrats both complain that you're in the bag for the other party. So RPAC, we all get a suggested minimum donation amount that appears on our annual dues statement. And interestingly, an overwhelming majority, 80% of Illinois realtors don't contribute a penny. The $20 minimum suggested contribution in the course of the year, multiplied by the tens of thousands of realtors in the state of Illinois, helps leverage influence in a way that is really quite spectacular in terms of helping our political agenda get advanced. We've all seen examples of federal legislation making our jobs more difficult. In the ABR class this week, there were a lot of people in the room that had no idea what impact some of the latest federal legislation had on disclosure obligations with respect to handing out a rate sheet at an open house. Congress now is involved in policing what you can hand out in terms of a rate sheet at your open house. So I've got a short video about RPAC that I'm going to play next. I'm going to jump back and give you a very quick commercial for getting involved in leadership at the CCAR level. I can tell you, having been kind of shocked since I didn't know what I was doing or really how things ran around here until I got drafted and then accidentally elected into an executive officer position. It consumes a lot of time, but there's a lot of important issues that we can make a difference on here at the local level. And there are some very nice perks that come along with it. There's some great training and leadership opportunities. We have other past presidents that are here in the room that can attest to some of these. Some of the opportunities that I've had afforded to me at no cost by virtue of being in leadership here. Illinois Association of Realtors puts on a great spokesperson training program. That's great for media relations, great for becoming a better public speaker in general. It's a whole day workshop. That's something that they do for incoming local association presidents, because one of the things that each local association president is for that year in office is they are the official spokesperson for the organization, for the industry for that year. And I can honestly say I do a better job of that than I would have had I not had some of the training that IAR has provided that I haven't personally had to pay for. They've done a program they call Surround Sound Training, which is a day-long program that was at the Illinois Association of Realtors headquarters in Springfield. There are leadership training opportunities. That does not require that you be in leadership here. If you serve on any committee at the state or local level, you'll get an email. You'll get a mailed invitation to apply to a competitive acceptance, only 12-member class in the entire state. But it's a leadership training program that has several different modules. 2 of which I've now been to now. So I'm one of the people that's going into that program for this year. Julie Roth is in the outgoing class. The outgoing and the incoming overlap at one module, so we got to spend a memorable couple of days together in Oak Brook earlier this year. And that's, again, something I didn't have to pay for. It's on IAR's dime, and it is something that can pay dividends for the rest of your career in any number of different ways. So there are some very good reasons to get involved. Going to the mid-year conference, basically the equivalent of Capitol Conference in Springfield. Well, in May, the same thing happens at the national level with several thousand realtors that show up in Washington, D.C. If you're president-elect or president at the association, your trip out to D.C. gets paid for, and that's a real eye-opener as well. And so Max Mitchell and I and a few others got to spend time with Representative Tim Johnson in our trip to D.C. last year. Which is, I don't know, dubious honor, it depends. He came with his hot water and his tea bags, because he doesn't eat. Any questions on that? Okay, so, what's new at CCAR? We have been collectively on the board holding our breath because what happens at the beginning of the year in our world as CCAR members? Dues, bills. So we billed for 475, Linda. We sent out 475. 470 bills went out. We had budgeted for this budget year. We had budgeted based on the assumption that our membership would drop to a total of about 446, and that includes services only, correct, Linda? Yes. That was a combination of realtor members and services only. So we ended up keeping very close to that number, but we were holding our collective breath because you would be shocked what a high percentage pays at the last possible minute. So, you know, the last week in January, it certainly looked like we could be losing 150, 200 members. The last week in January, I mean, days before people started incurring a late charge, and only days before they got the plug pulled from their MLS access. We have ended up very much on track for what we had projected for budgeting purposes last year. That's the good news. To explain why that is such good news, almost all of our revenue, we have some non-dues sources of revenue, but most of our revenue is in direct proportion to the number of members that we have in the association. A worst case scenario for us, when you combine the economy and the license law transition and some increases in fees at the local and state and national levels, the worst case scenario for us would be to lose, say, 150, 200 members. We can't cut back service. I mean, we have core services we have to provide. Those are not directly proportional to the membership numbers. Worst case scenario is we would have lost a third of our members, had to make up the revenue by doing massive fee increases on the members we have left. And if it's that massive, that ends up pushing more members right out the door, and you go into this downward death spiral. So the good news is no death spiral. That's very good news. The news for a little concern, though, is even though we didn't underperform what we had projected still came in, even being very conscious of costs and expenditures and trying to cut back on costs in any way we responsibly could. We're still going to be running about a $12,000 deficit. We have reserves for so that we have the ability to do that. So we're able to strategically plan either increases in revenue or decreases in spending or both going forward, but we do have a deficit that's going to have to be plugged. We're not going to pretend that we run the state of Illinois and see how we can make that number bigger and sustain it over a long period of time. We're fairly responsible here when it comes to finances. So we're going to have to look at ways to continue to cut costs and increase revenues, and I'm here to tell you, having now had a front row seat to the budgeting process for a few years in a row, we are being very, very conscious of costs. The staff here have been in pay freezes for 3 years.
Yes.
You're going to all know better than I will in the back of the room. For those of us who sell real estate for a living, we're accustomed to volatility, and many of us are now working more to make less. But in their world, especially with the number of years of service that all the staff have had here, working for multiple years of pay freezes is no small deal. Linda's been under a pay freeze as well. We obviously lost a staffer unexpectedly. And given that we hadn't had a personnel change here in, over a dozen years, right? That's a huge deal. That's a small group. That is a family. And to have somebody disappear pretty unexpectedly on very short notice was a very, very big deal here. So not only was it a big deal because it was a disruption to the family, but there was a job description that has not yet been filled, and everyone else on staff has scrambled in ways that most of us don't get to see. Nobody has drawn lines in the sand and said, I'm not stepping 1 inch outside of my job description. I don't care. I'm not paid for that. We haven't had any of that happening. The staff have just dealt with it, really no questions asked, on faith that we're going to get through it and get personnel issues reallocated and reassigned when we get a staff position filled. Just to give you a quick update on how that's going to look, we just at the last Board of Directors meeting discussed, remember I said the staff belonged to Linda, and Linda then has the budget, the budgetary authority based on what was allocated for Art's salary, for example, to be able to go out and hire somebody right away if she wants to. The plan is she plans to bring in somebody on a part-time basis, 20, 25 hours a week, sort of at a very entry-level position to help basically take the pressure off the other staff. It's very difficult when, for example, this week, Martha is tied to a continuing education class that's in process because she's the only person she has to basically police the room and proctor the test. And if Darcy's trying to now do MLS administrative duties, and she's on the phone helping somebody with an Innovia question, and the phone rings, Susie, who's in the middle of membership or financial-related record-keeping tasks, then has to stop what she's doing to answer the phone. I mean, so it involves quite a lot of juggling and quite a lot of inefficiency by having the staff all having to jump for the phone, making every phone call a jump ball. So we're going to bring in somebody part-time in the very near future to get us through the remainder of the current budget year, which ends in September, right? And then the plan will be closer to the end of the budget year, we'll end up doing a top-to-bottom reassessment and reallocation of sort of HR responsibilities. I'm not expecting we're going to replace Art's job with somebody with the exact same job description. There's going to be a needs analysis done for what the association needs today, what the existing staff are able to do, because people are very well cross-trained here that are on staff, figure out what that new position needs to look like, and then get it staffed on a permanent basis going forward. Any questions about that? Okay, so that's the plan on personnel. We don't have any cost increases, or we don't have any dues or fees increases on the table right this minute. Not at all out of the question. But as I said, because we didn't have massive membership losses, we will have a relatively modest budget hole to plug. So if we end up with a discussion of fees increases, it appears that we'd be looking at something under $10 a month. So again, nothing on the table at this point. Don't get too concerned yet. Or complain to me preemptively, whatever you prefer.
Oh, we want to do that.
Right, right. Okay, so other updates going on. Contract. I promised the week I went to visit Keller Williams, I promised that the contract was coming out the next week. The same week I promised that, the real estate committee of the Champaign County Bar Association seemed hell-bent on making a liar out of the president of the Champaign County Association of Realtors, who's the longtime chairman of the contract working group. We had a videographer booked here to videotape the attorneys rolling out the contract. We're videoing their training session so that every new member and any other member who wants it will have full access to the attorneys themselves doing a complete orientation to the contract. I think that will be a tremendous resource going forward since, as we've seen, the contracts are out there for 10 or 12 years, even if we start the next revision the day after the next one comes out. So they canceled because they were literally preparing who was going to say what, and they realized that they weren't even in agreement on what their own documents said. So with less than a business day of notice, the videographer was called off. They've gone back into more meetings. I've gone back into more meetings. We got at least one more joint meeting, and I still actually expect that that contract will be released here within a month or two. The way we're going to do that is once the document has been finalized for real, it's been finalized several other times, once it's finalized for real, or faux reals, as the kids like to say, then what we will end up doing, haha everyone, then what we'll end up doing is we'll release that in a preview copy to our members to look at. It won't go into effect immediately. We'll then release the video. We'll give that a period of weeks in our local market to give our members an opportunity to get trained on it. We will probably then schedule a follow-up live Q&A session with the attorneys. They're wanting to do sort of their scripted rollout orientation but not be subjected to a live audience at that point. So we'll do a live Q&A, and then the contract will have an official date when the new version becomes the official one. Any questions on that? Thanks. Thanks, Stacey. Okay, so let's see. We got contract. We're getting a YPN launch, Young Professionals Network. There's been a lot of activity for YPN organizations at the local level. That's Young Professionals Network that targets realtors who are under 40. But there's no hard and fast cutoff. At the local level, we have Shannon Lewis is one of the people, and Kelly Ratcliffe, who's not in the room today, and I are working on helping to get that launched. But it was Shannon and Kelly who came to us and said, you know, how can we get this started? So we've already had a consultation with 2 staffers from the Illinois Association of Realtors. We just passed at the Board of Directors meeting last week the $200 sort of fund to help do a launch event. And we're going to try to launch this concurrently with other downstate Central Illinois associations with the idea of there'll be some ongoing online network and then maybe schedule in-person events maybe once a quarter and try to bring in a larger population. Part of why that's important to all of the members, because I've heard people roll their eyes and say, why do we give a crap about the young people? Well, no one gave a crap about me when I was a young person getting started. But part of the reason is it goes to the long-term sustainability of our organization. Anything we can do to help ensure that younger members coming in the door hit critical mass in their own businesses and are viable and stay viable is going to help ensure that we have members and we have revenues 10 and 12 and 20 years into the future. In addition to the fact that just like WCR and a lot of other realtor-related organizations, there are going to be opportunities for education and learning. So that's the YPN update. Education update. So Chris, you're on that committee, correct? We just this week, Monday and Tuesday, had an out-of-area speaker who is a national speaker. She was one of the speakers at the National Association of Realtors convention in Anaheim in November. She was here for a 2-day ABR certification course, which also counted for 6 hours of continuing ed. It is a big deal to get in a national speaker who's trained to do that. We are blessed for a small market. We got at least 2 of them in the room with instructors who do pre-license and CE stuff here. So I don't want to understate how good a resource that is, but to get the variety and to get somebody who comes in that's very specialized in some other area that's a fairly intensive course, almost every buyer's agent on Ryan's team was there. I mean, my office had literally a dozen people that were in that class. That's a big, big deal. If we didn't have it here, people would be traveling out of town, paying for a hotel room, and they could not go meet their buyer client, as I did both of those days right after they left here at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. That was a tremendous opportunity, and one that our education working group made happen, and one that I'm looking forward to future opportunities with. So thank you, Chris, for your group's work on that. Let's see, what's next on here? Financial update, HR. What questions do you guys have? Because I think that's everything I wanted to make sure I discussed. Chris?
Matt, could I just plug for everyone who's here in the room who are pretty much all very engaged people with things. One of the things we just finished up with education was the transition classes. But I would caution everybody not to relax at this point. There are a lot of folks who still need their CE credits, etc. And I would sort of challenge everyone in this room to make sure people who you work with, people on your teams, whatever, make it your personal responsibility to check out what they still need to do so they can get that completed in time. It'll be a tragedy if we get to April and all of a sudden there's a couple people who don't have a valid license to hang because they're missing 3 hours of CE or something like that. So
that's a very good point, because we feel like as an association financially we dodged a bullet, that we had the number of people that we ultimately did who paid their dues and are planning on staying in for the next year. We still have an awful lot of those people who have not fully finished their transition requirements. And there are a couple of issues. Number one, you'll be guilty of practicing without a license if you get past April 30th and haven't met all of your conditions for renewal. And secondly, not only will you end up in violation of the law, but you'll have to start over from the very beginning. I mean, it will cost you a tremendous amount of wasted money and time if you let that lapse and have to start over from the beginning. Don't let that happen. And from the association standpoint, we love the fact that the people who may get their licenses yanked have at least paid their dues for the whole year. We really appreciate that, but would way rather have them be licensed, continue to practice, and pay their participation fees all the way through the year. So Chris's point is a good one. Make sure you're asking around your office. Make sure your managing brokers are proactively looking to see how many hours of CE people have if they have already gotten the broker's license but don't yet have the continuing ed finished up.
Matt, I don't think people realize that that ABR course was a special offer price-wise to our membership, because I drove to Bloomington and it was a lot more expensive. And if we watch that as an education committee, which we have, there will be other possible opportunities where we can bring these courses here.
That is a very good point, because I didn't realize that until I was talking to Chris this morning. So not only do we have the convenience of having a national speaker in our relatively small local market, but until I was talking to Chris, I didn't know what Nancy just said. We got a real deal on pricing. And so we had a couple of bonuses. It was 6 hours of elective CE, which was the first, I'll be honest, that was the first and foremost reason that I signed up for it. But for pure CE, it's kind of inefficient because it was 2 full days to only get the 6 hours. But it was a really good quality course, and the overall pricing, while I think it was still an obstacle for some people who didn't want to write another check this time of year for another couple $100, it was a whole lot less expensive than what that course would normally cost, and you didn't have to pay for a hotel room or drive 45 minutes or an hour each way to get there.
Which brings about the opportunities for scholarships here.
Oh, that's, yeah. So if you're running into a financial impediment, we do have scholarship money to help make sure that folks are able to get into these classes. So please let us know. That's an excellent idea, excellent commercial for that.
You have to be involved in some type of committee to be eligible for
Right.
that.
Can't be a freeloader and get a scholarship. What else is on your minds? What have I done that's annoyed you lately? Come on.
Well, I think another thing is you have to be involved in order to reach the level where Matt is. In order to run for the board and everything else, you need to serve on committees. So now's the time to start building that.
So
serving on the nominating committee, we found that there are a lot of people that haven't even been on a committee. So we were encouraging you, and I'm glad to see you doing that.
Thank you. So on that subject, so everyone in the room at some point, even if you won't admit it, has thought, what were the idiots over there thinking when they did, and you fill in the blank. Well, you can't just decide, I'm going to run for the board of directors, I'm going to run for secretary treasurer and run the chairs, and I'm going to change the whole deal. You can't do that overnight. You got to have the prerequisite levels of service. But not only do you need to get involved somewhere at a lower level, but there's very important work being done at those working group levels. So do get involved, and that opens up other opportunities down the road. We have to draft people. We have to ask every year for people to be put on the ballot. We never have enough volunteers to slate a ballot with competitive elections for all of our open board of directors seats and our executive officer seats. And we find out shockingly, I mean, we have hundreds of members from whom to choose and from whom to ask. And year after year, we realize there's almost nobody left who has the required level of service who's willing to be drafted to run and appear on the ballot. We always need good people, and we want competitive elections. I sent thank you notes to the people who did not win in the last set of elections because it is a huge deal that they were willing to be slated. It helps make the elections more legitimate, and we didn't have a bad candidate. All the candidates were very good, and just being willing to be slated and having had the prerequisite level of service to qualify is a big deal because there are not a lot of people that do. And it's also shocking to go through. Linda has sort of a biographical sketch of every person in the association. She's a little like J. Edgar Hoover that way. Except I think she looks better in heels than he did. But we have this little sketch on all of the members that shows their historic areas of involvement. It is shocking how many members have been involved as realtor members for 20 or 30 years and have had no service ever on a committee or on a working group. Don't be that person. Did I see a hand up back there, Betty?
I just wanted to say congratulations on some really quality press releases that you have done.
Oh, thank you.
I actually have a seller who has relocated to Phoenix, and I was talking to him about the price of his home here in Urbana. And I commented about the positive press, and he said, I read it, and yes, your president was positive, and I really want to compliment you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now it makes it makes it easier that so far there have been positive nuggets to use. So poor Max and a couple other poor past presidents got stuck with just nothing but negative headlines. But honestly, I did have to go looking for the positive headline. The normal stats that we release, just the very basic stats that we send over every month. If I hadn't gone mining that data, it would have just, the headline for January would have been closed sales, closed volumes down again year over year for January. So I had to go digging to find the positive stat, which was pending sales up 34.23%. Thank you. Anything else, guys? And I'll hang around if anyone wants to chat about anything individually. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to show up.
Thank you.